I'm Robin Mace Fisher. I'm a graduate student at Rutgers University in Newark.
My name is Patricia Gavin. I'm a PhD student at Rutgers University in Newark.
My name is Rashi Shukla, and I'm a PhD student at Rutgers University in Newark.
I'm Cynthia Nahabidi, and I'm a graduate student at Rutgers University in Newark, New Jersey.
I'm Justin Reedy, and I'm also a graduate student at Rutgers University in Newark.
My name is Lori Ellis, and I'm a PhD student at the University of Maryland, College Park.
I'm Janice Hilson from Sam Houston State University, Huntsville, Texas.
I'm Amy Bishop O'Regan. I'm a graduate student at Rutgers University in Newark.
Good afternoon. I am Frank Taylor Robbins, and you are witnessing today the first of the joint ACJS-ASC demonstration projects for oral history of criminology, criminal justice. And in this demonstration, Professor Gilbert Geis of the University of California, Irvine, is going to be conducting a class in white-collar crime with selected graduate students from throughout the country. As the graduate students introduce themselves, they will be responding to Professor Geis. The format is going to be, today Professor Geis will speak for approximately 10 minutes, then the discussion will be opened up to the students. Thank you very much, Professor Geis.
Thank you, Frank. What I want to do is simply talk for a few minutes and just throw out some ideas about white-collar crime, and then we'll pick up the questions and try to get some sort of a portrait of the phenomena. Historically, the idea of white-collar crime was introduced into American criminology in 1939 during the meetings of the American Sociological Association and the American Economic Association joint meeting in Philadelphia at the Benjamin Franklin Hotel. They met then between Christmas and New Year's, later changed to earlier in the year. Interestingly, the Philadelphia Inquirer and the New York Times both ran very large stories on the presidential address at the American Sociological Association by Edwin Sutherland, about 50 years old at the time, who was from Indiana University and who had coined the term white-collar crime. Parenthetically, it does illustrate that if you have a concept and you pin a colorful name on it, even in so intellectual an enterprise as criminology, there is a certain kind of popularity associated with things that can be tagged in a fairly colorful sort of way. Sutherland maintained, rather disingenuously, that what he was trying to do was to reform theory in American criminology by talking about white-collar crime. His argument essentially was that obviously feeble-mindedness, broken homes, psychiatric distortions of personality could not cause crime because clearly they didn't cause white-collar crime. It apparently never occurred to him that different kinds of crimes might be caused in different sorts of ways, primarily because he was pushing, and I use that term advisedly, a theory of his own called differential association, which would account for all kinds of crime. Therefore, he did not feel it incumbent upon him to differentiate with any clarity, or to differentiate at all, if you will, between crimes, and just kind of threw white-collar crime in. He also failed us miserably, desperately, by not providing a very precise definition of his subject matter, which really is incumbent upon a scientist, and Sutherland was a very, very good scientist to do, but he somehow defaulted on this. Again, probably because it didn't matter very much in terms of his theoretical impulses. He said at one point, and it was fairly obvious, that he was interested in crimes by powerful people, important people, people who are using their office, their privilege to depredate the society. On the other hand, in the appendix, he gives a good deal of illustrations of shoe salesmen at Thomas McCann. Incidentally, they tended to be personal. Sutherland had been a shoe salesman at Thomas McCann, and how they cheated and beguiled customers. You know, you take the shoe and you say, you know, these run big or they run little. You know, all sorts of gimmicks to, when you take the shoes off a customer, you put them as far away as possible so they can't get them back and leave the store while you're hunting around for some wrong fit. Sutherland himself is rather interesting. He was of a very rigid Baptist background, grew up in a little town called Gibbon, Nebraska, was born there. Grew up in Grand Island, Nebraska, which some of you may recognize as the home of Henry Fonda. His father was the president of the Grand Island a Baptist school in Grand Island, a college. Sutherland graduated from that college. His father was very active in the populist movement, which permeated Sutherland's thinking, his ideology. The populists were in rebellion against the railroads, against the exploitation of farmers. And it's very obvious that that's where his political ideology comes from. It comes from the populist rebellion of the Midwest against the big cities, the big corporations, et cetera, et cetera. Though Sutherland, when he became older, became a Baptist in retreat. He was a fairly, well, high living is not quite accurate. He was very proper, but he had his own idiosyncratic. He certainly wasn't a good Baptist. Let's put it that way. That's about as kindly as I can put it. He is a very brilliant man. In fact, I interviewed one of his former graduate students, and who was married to a very famous Byron scholar in New York, and she always used to taunt her husband when she got mad at him that when she was in Indiana working for Sutherland, that was how a scholar really ought to work, how hard he ought to work. He has very few publications. For a man who's renowned, probably the most renowned American criminologist, his beta looks very slim indeed. But what he wrote was quite good. He got his degree at the University of Chicago, went and taught at William Jewell College in Liberty, Missouri, which is a moral in that, too, for 6 years. That's a long exile. Published one article in 6 years after his PhD, and then began teaching in the Big Ten schools in the Midwest. Went back to Chicago, got fired from there, though I can't find the records exactly. Everybody knows that something happened, but nobody is quite aware of what. Went to Minnesota, Illinois, and ultimately spent a large part of his life at the Indiana University as chair of the sociology department. He was very fortunate. He had graduate students who were crazy about him, intellectually and personally, particularly Don Cressy and Al Cohn, both of whom became inestimably famous and promulgated Sutherland's ideas. Anyway, in '49, 10 years after the presentation, he wrote a book. This was only a year before he died. And I talked to Cressy once and said, it seems to me the book's, however much a classic, is fairly sloppy. Maybe he was sick. Cressy, in his fairly peremptory way, dismissed that idea. Cressy told you what he thought and told you no uncertain terms. But I still think, since Cressy can't answer back anymore, that I was right. Anyway, the book it's short. He gave in and deleted the names of all of the corporations that he was inveighing against because the publisher was afraid of being sued, and it wasn't until 20 years later that the book was reprinted with the names of those people on it. White Collar Crime after Sutherland essentially was an enterprise of his students, Clenard, or their students, Clenard, Richard Quinney, who was Clenard's student, Don Newman, who was Clenard's student, Cressy, of course, as I said, was Sutherland's student. There was a proliferation of writing on the subject, an awful lot of concern with what the hell is the definition? What is an accurate, reasonable definition of the behavior? That lasted until Joseph McCarthy came into the United States Senate. McCarthy put a quietus on all of liberal research, which of course was redefined as communist propaganda. And nothing was written about white-collar crime for 10 years. Then there's been a vivid resurrection of it, very much triggered by the grant from the federal government given to Stan Wheeler at Yale University. And Wheeler's work, though there's not much of it in the literature, Tony Vivita's written a book about it, has been very controversial, at least to me. I'm talking purely personally, because Wheeler defined white-collar crime legally. And that's one of the issues that we have to get into, rather than, in a sense, sociologically, as Sutherland had. So that ultimately you have perfectly good illustrations. Dave Weisberg's article in the current issue of Criminology, in which he says, everybody's been wrong. White-collar criminals are not deterred by the threat of prison. The only problem with that conclusion, however brilliant and accurate and so well supported by very sophisticated statistics, is his definition of white-collar crime is not my definition of white-collar crime. He's defining it as women who pass bad checks in the supermarket. Kathy Daly, who wrote an article on gender and white-collar crime, for example, points out that 1/3 of the women in her sample aren't working. You know, now to say that a person who is unemployed, who commits a crime that is defined as a white-collar crime, is a white-collar criminal, really is a tremendous defiance of what I consider the essential element of the concept that is the abuse of power, which is the United Nations definition. Anyway, one last point, and then I'll quit. What I like about working in white-collar crime, what I've always liked about it is, or have liked, there are two things really I've liked. One, of course, it's enormously challenging intellectually. And I think one of the aims of life is to try to do something that you can't do, that's a little bit beyond your reach. You need to know sociology, you need to know law, you need to know regulatory law, you need to know economics, you need to learn something about organizational theory, you need to know sociology, you need to know criminal justice. It is a field that is extremely demanding in terms of what you have to encompass within your own mind. And in that sense, it's, to my mind, invigorating. Secondly, of course, is the fact that you're really dealing with something that I can be hostile to. You know, whenever I deal with burglary and robbery and those sorts of offenses, I really have at least a strong element of sympathy for the people that I'm studying. You know, they come from the lower classes, they're deprived, they're picked on. You know, I much prefer that they don't commit crime, but at least one has to empathize with a guy who uses drugs instead of sandpapering furniture, which is the only job he can get. It's very hard to sympathize with doctors who make $220,000 and still flagrantly cheat the government medical programs. So I'm saying from my personal, purely personal ideological viewpoint, white-collar crime seems a more pleasant and virtuous kind of intellectual pursuit. And nobody can tell me that criminology is not value-ridden. Any intellectual enterprise is value-ridden. And I just assume that it follow my research follow, at least be in line with my values, however pure the research, I'd like to believe, is and however impartial it is. But at least the subject fits my inclination. Anyway, those are some very brief introductory, I'm sure rather all over the place, and what I'd like to do now is to entertain any questions that you guys have. Don't hurry to be first.
I'll start.
Sure.
How would you define your definition of white-collar crime?
Well, as I said, it's probably worth repeating. You can certainly go legal. You can say that there are these statutes which anybody who commits any of these offenses is a white-collar criminal. I much prefer, though it's much more difficult, what I would call a socio-political definition. It's an individual who has a position, a status of importance, and in the course of that position violates a law. So I start with my focus is on the position. He's a CEO of a corporation. He's a member of the United States Congress. He's not an unemployed woman who's passing bad checks at the supermarket. Because I think when you start doing that, you distort the concept. And then you write a book, as David did, Crimes of the Middle Class. They're not even middle class. You know, unemployed people are, generally speaking, not in the middle class even. Yeah, that's the way I define it. But it's a tougher definition. The other one's very easy because you've got your universe immediately pointed out to you. You know, anybody who committed any of 13 enumerated offenses is a white-collar criminal. And then they come to that extraordinarily counterintuitive conclusion that white-collar criminals are punished more severely than routine criminals. You know, these, oh, Sutherland's all wrong. But that's, again, a function of the sample, not a function of what I would regard as the inherent situation. Fair enough? Mm-hmm. I could ask you how you would define it. Sir? Miss?
Okay, I have a question actually about corporate crime control.
Sure.
What role, if any, do you see sentencing guidelines playing?
Oh, that's a very tough question. The United States sentencing guidelines for corporations were promulgated, I think, a few years ago, after all the other sentencing guidelines. They're very controversial. The key point of them, at least in my mind, there are two key points really. There's a probation provision, which means that the court can, in its infinite wisdom, impose a whole variety of conditions on a corporation. It can make it bring outsiders onto the board of directors. It can threaten it with all sorts of penalties if it doesn't shape up its accounting system, et cetera, et cetera. It also allows a lessening of the penalties if the corporation demonstrates that it has made good faith efforts to avoid this kind of offense. I don't think there's any good work yet on effect. There's one study, the only study that I'm aware of says they really haven't used it very much. They've only had about 10 or 12 cases since the corporate guidelines were in. The whole issue of corporate liability, incidentally, is an astonishingly complicated. And again, I've got an idiosyncratic view. I don't think they ought to punish corporations criminally. I probably am the only one in the world who doesn't think that, and I'm probably totally wrong, which of course would be the first time. I don't think they ought to punish corporations criminally for the reason that I think they do so easily, by default. Instead of going after people, it is so much easier to get the corporation. Secondly, of course, the corporation is where the money is. So they go after the corporation because it has, in the elegant term of the law, it has deep pockets. I think they ought to go after people. I think they ought to punish corporations civilly. And I've always thought that. An even more intriguing issue, which is implicit in your question, is how in God's name do you derive a theory of corporate crime when you don't have when a corporation is a human entity? Is it possible to have a theory of corporate crime? You certainly can't have a social psychological theory of corporate crime. I'll give you one illustration, then I'll quit. There used to be an old common law principle that if a ship is within the 12-mile limit and a certain offense occurs to it, then the owner is liable. It's a corporate crime. If the ship's outside the 12-mile limit and the offense occurs, then they're not liable. Now, if you're trying to get a theory of causation, I can't conceive of how you can get a theory of causation for all of those strict liability offenses. Strict liability essentially means that you're criminally responsible even if you didn't know what was going on. It's implicit in it, of course, the idea you should have known, but that's not part of the law. So in the Park case, for example, his factory was contaminated with rodent droppings and everything else, and they held him criminally responsible. He didn't know about it. He said he didn't. And how do you get a theory of crime that involves a person who doesn't know what he did? It's like saying I'm standing on the top of the Empire State Building and I knock a flower pot off and it kills somebody below. Is that a criminal act? Well, you say somebody's dead, somebody's got to pay the price. You may remember in the 15th century we punished animals. If an ox came along and stuck its, whatever oxes have, into you, then they'd kill the ox. And that got very difficult when railroads were doing the same thing, because then they'd confiscate the railroad and the king could only have so many railroads. And then it got very complicated what he was going to do with all his railroads. That's supposed to be humorous. Anyway, I don't want to talk to her. Sir?
Do you have any comments about the variations in seriousness in white-collar crime since you've been studying the topic?
Yeah, I would very much. Nobody's ever done the definitive work on this. I really agree totally with Sutherland. In 1939, he stated that white-collar crime is infinitely more expensive than the society than all the other crimes put together. Bank embezzlement, he pointed out, accounts for very, very much more than bank robberies. I think white-collar crime is desperately outweighs, in terms of the costs and consequences, all other forms of crime put together. I don't think that finding is ever, it hasn't been substantially proven, but every time you look at a hunk of it, it's fairly obvious, that it's very, very expensive to the society. And what happens is, in one ironic sort of way, street criminals can only steal so much because they don't have the opportunity. You get to be head of the corporation, you've got a lot of resources to play with. And, you can steal millions and millions and millions of dollars. It just overwhelmingly outweighs street crime, I think. Miss?
Professor, related to what you just said, do you think that the commission of white-collar crime is more a result of socialization, either childhood or corporate professional, or opportunity?
Clearly the second. That's my personal point. I think it's virtually impossible to predict who within a corporation is going to violate the law prior to entry into the corporation. I think that's almost solved. Now, obviously, you know, in the old days at least, and I'm sure right now, you find someone in your office who's embezzling. Well, you got two choices. You can report them and prosecute them. You're not going to get any money back because you spent it all. But by far and away, the best bet is to give them a brilliant recommendation and let them work for your competitor, which often can be done. But you know, it's not predictive. It's very much. It's very, very much like spying. They've done some very good studies on people who turn out to be spies. And it's the disenchantment that occurs within the work setting that leads to the, or it's the incorporation, the training. You know, policemen come out of it's the best analogy I can give. They come out of the training academy, you know, with little angels, with little halos over their head, and then they get out in the patrol car, and the cop they're working with tells them how it really is. You know, this is the way we do it here. And those guys' opinion, the one you're riding with, his opinion is infinitely more important than the remote instructor of the police can. That's true of the corporation. In the GE case, you know, they came out of Georgia Tech. They were generally engineers, and you know, everybody says, well, this is the way we do it. We meet with the competitors, we set prices, and they all did it. One guy didn't do it. In the whole GE case, I love that guy. I wish I had found that guy before he died. Frank Reber, his name was. And he said, but he says, I signed something that says I'm not going to do that. And they all looked at him and they said, well, what a strange duck he is. He says, yeah, but I'm very religious, and I believe that when you sign something, you're supposed to do that. And they transferred him. They didn't fire him. They didn't penalize him. They transferred him laterally. And they got another guy in who thought, gee, that was a very strange idea that when you sign something, it has some meaning. And he met with competitors and fixed prices. But you learn that in the job, just as students learn what is and isn't permissible, and professors learn, hopefully.
I have a question on sentencing.
Sure.
It's often suggested that white-collar criminals experience more effective secondary sanctions.
Mm-hmm.
Should these be taken into consideration in the sentencing of white-collar offenders?
That's a very good question.
Second part to that would be, if it is taken into consideration, how do you ensure that they're not discriminatorily sanctioned?
Yeah. Well, I can answer the second one by answering the first one, because I don't think it should be taken into consideration. But that's my hard-nosed, you know, I'm really not, you know, Susan Shapiro is, and I suspect people of a younger generation are much more sympathetic, I think, and I don't mean that invidiously, are much more sympathetic to white-collar criminals than I am. I grew up in a, you know, an environment that was sort of like Sutherland's, only, you know, a few years later. I don't care about secondary sanctions. You know, they've enjoyed all the pleasure and privilege and all those good things that go with the $200,000 a year salaries. And sure, you know, nobody talks about the robber's family that suffers, you know, enormous deprivation when he goes to jail. And everybody's talking about, you know, they laugh at his kids at the country club, and they won't let him use the swimming pool on weekdays, and they throw him out of the church, and he's lost this marvelous job. You know, I think with all those goodies goes responsibility. I think that, you know, the book I just finished was on medical doctors, and they're cheating those programs left, right, and center. They're cheating them blind. You know, I don't mean every doctor, and I don't mean most doctors, though I would qualify that less. I'm not sure about most doctors. But certainly an awful lot of doctors are cheating those programs. And one could say, well, they lose their medical license, their whole life is ruined. Of course, they don't lose their medical license. That's just cheating. That's not bad practice of medicine. You know, those very distinctive sorts of things. You can still do a tonsillectomy. But you know, I don't care. You know, he went to medical school in the state anyway. You know, we paid for his medical education, and we can train a few more doctors. We ought to make nurses doctors. After 10 years, it would be a lot simpler. They'd no more doctors anyway. Yeah. Is that responsive, incidentally? If I don't answer the question, or if I try to dodge it, I'm trying to learn very hard from politicians. When someone asks you a question, answer another one. But it's very difficult if you've been teaching for a while.
It just seems like it would be really difficult to get the judges to not take those into
Yes,
consideration.
it's impossible.
Because
Judges are from the same social class. And not many of them, very few of them, but some of them are doing the same things. Yes, it's very difficult to get judges not to take that into account, and they will express it. They will say, "Oh, this poor guy." Yeah, you could argue, for example, to take something that's in all of our minds, or was in all of them, the Simpson thing. What difference does it make that he wasn't sentenced? He suffered. He was in prison for a year, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. You're not going to kill anybody else, I hope. Presuming he killed his wife, which I'm willing to presume.
I had a question on policy implications and white-collar crime. And kind of the current national debate is focusing a little bit more on violent crime and drugs. And are there any
Very
policy
much.
implications
Oh,
that come
sure.
from the exclusion of white-collar crime from
Oh,
those
sure.
debates?
Sure. That's another very good question, too. Nobody's ever tracked it. But obviously, the political coloration of the administration and the what would you say? I was trying to think of a nice word. But sociologists, criminologists tend to go to go where the money is too, and criminology research tends to follow the money. And when you have a political regime such as now it's the Congress is conservative, and conservatives prefer to focus on violence and drugs. When Jimmy Carter was in, an enormous amount of money went to white-collar crime. I wouldn't argue, incidentally. I'd have a lot of trouble arguing that which is more important. I have nothing very much to say for violence and drugs either, and I don't mean to say, and as far as most people are concerned, that it's overwhelming the problem that they see as crime. I just think corporate crime, in some subtle way, may have something to do with violence and drugs. It tends to fractionate and alienate people who watch very rich people getting away with an awful lot of things. Now that's subtle, and I'm probably wrong on that, but I think it does. Crime is obviously is caused by the ethos of a society. I don't think there's any question about that. It's an issue that criminologists never address because they don't know what to do with it. Japan has very little crime because Japan's a different country than us. It's an industrialized country, as we are. Switzerland is an industrialized country. Everybody has a gun, but there's no crime and no street crime. It's what a society is like. And corporate crime, to some enormous extent, delineates what the society is about. John Braithwaite says you ought to shame people, like Japan. But how can you shame them when the people who are doing the shaming are doing the same sorts of things in their own particular way? It's very hard to take a high moral stance unless you're pure. It really is. It's very difficult. I had that trouble with my children. I could, you don't do that, and then you keep thinking, well, I did it. It's very difficult. You got to forget that and pretend that you didn't do it. They're smarter than you are.
I also have a question that deals with policy. In light of the reluctance of many corporations to expose internal wrongdoing within their company, how would you propose building or expanding cooperation between corporations and their security departments?
The answer really is implicit in the sentencing guideline question as well. You reward them. You tell them that if, in fact, that is in the sentencing guidelines. If you tell us that this naughtiness is going on in your midst, then we will be much more lenient with you. So that, in that sense, you offer them, they still have to, as all of us do, they still have to calculate the cost-benefit. Will they find out if we don't tell them? That's always the implicit question. But to the extent that they're nervous about your finding out, then it is very much in their interest to tell you first. They'll get good point. Just as, in any criminal case, if you turn yourself into the police, they always will, or not always, but there's a tendency to say, we'll go a little easier on you. We don't need to go hunt you down. Fair enough.
Despite the proliferation of research on white-collar crime in the last 20 to 30 years, we still don't have any national statistics.
Never going to get them.
Is there any way to construct something?
There's a brilliant, absolutely brilliant study by two brilliant criminologists, Al Reese and Albert Bitterman. Just a superb study. It's called Data Sources on White-Collar Crime or Corporate Crime, not sure the title. Published by the, I think the National Institute of Justice or the old LEAA, I think. And you'd be very hard-pressed to find two finer minds in the field. And they spent a couple of years running around desperately trying to figure out how to put together statistics on white-collar crime. It's not an easy book to find, and it's not an easy book to read. But the conclusions are rather depressing. It's almost it's so proactive. That's the whole key to it. In a sense, the proactive reactive, which is Reese's term, of course, which he introduced into the literature. Take the FTC, the Federal Trade Commission. Almost all of its cases are mailbox cases, they call them. That is, they come in over the transom. Somebody calls out, usually a competitor, and says, "Hey, these guys are doing this and that and the other thing," so that you don't get any sense of what's going on out there. You only get a sense. Now that's true in. Very true in street crime, but you can do victimization surveys. You can get some sort of ratio and to it, but it's very hard in white-collar crime to get statistics. And incidentally, while I'm on the subject, just running off your question, another issue that is very rarely addressed in criminology, probably because it's too complicated, is the relationship of journal publication possibilities to the character and quality of research. So that I get graduate students constantly at Irvine who will say, "Well, I want a data set. Give me a data set. My kingdom for a data set." They want somebody who's collected a lot of information, and then they're very sophisticated at doing all the regression analyses and all the log linear things. And they know correctly that if they do this well, it's publishable if the data's reasonably decent. White-collar crime is much more difficult. You pick up the Criminology journal. There's very little stuff in white-collar crime. And again, the possibility in a publish-or-perish world, academic world, the possibility of the impetus to do research is conditioned by the potentiality and possibility and difficulty of publishing it. White-collar crime tends to end up as book stuff. Books take 2-3 years. If you're a junior faculty member looking for tenure, they're a very risky venture because they may not get done in time. So that the field itself conditions the work that's done. I will tell you, it's very exciting work to do. It's complicated, it's difficult, but there's a great deal of satisfaction. And maybe it's even jealousy. When we finished that book on doctors, we got a lot of pleasure out of doing that book. It's very hard. Most people are smart. They're not going to, you can't walk into a prison and say, "Hey, tell us all about it." And some kid who's lonesome and, some juvenile delinquent who's lonesome and weary, tells you a lot more than any person should. You're not going to get that kind out of a CEO. He's smarter than you are. You're smarter than I am. You're probably smarter than I am too. But you're dealing with someone who's pretty clever, and it's very difficult to get at material. On the other hand, criminologists have been desperately inadequate in their use of court materials, court trials. There's a vast amount of wonderful information that is put on the record in a court hearing. And attorneys often will talk to you endlessly. They're usually not when a case is sub judice, but after a case, and sometimes before a case. They're so lonesome, and nobody ever appreciates them adequately, that you go in there and you kind of sit there and look kind of dumb. I told you before, I worked on the New Brunswick newspaper, and I was dumb, and it was very helpful to convey that, because people took sympathy with you. I don't understand this, and they would try very hard to explain it to you. And lawyers will do that with graduate students. Well, I don't understand this case. What's going on now? To a point. They get exasperated after a while, but they will tell you an enormous amount of things if you have the patience. And white-collar crime, ultimately is a legal issue.
How do you think the expansion of computer-facilitated or high-tech crime would affect your definition of white-collar crime? Because the locus of power,
It's in the computer people.
Right, it's moving, and it's or it may move away from corporate center, and there's a lot of power to be abused.
Yeah, I think, you know, again, that's one of those things that causes so much difficulty with the definition, with the semantics of white-collar crime. I don't think the definition really is terribly important, and I don't mean to back away from where I was. I think if you want to study that, you know, it seems to me it's a studyable issue. If you want to call it white-collar crime, fine. If you don't want to, that's fine. But see, the trouble I had with the Weisberg-Wheeler stuff was they pretended it was white-collar crime. Well, that's not fair. They called it white-collar crime, but it did not fit a prior definition. They really should have called it what it was. You know, it was an analysis of people who violate specified statutes in the federal code, U.S. You know, the U.S. Code 13, volume 13. And, you know, it wasn't within the traditional definition. But to publish, again, you've got to, white-collar crime is it's a catchword. Where the heck are you going to get hypotheses? So you derive your hypothesis from white-collar crime. You know, Sutherland said that white-collar criminals are not punished very severely. Then you take your stuff and you've got a hypothesis to test. And you say, oh, no, you're dead wrong. Well, everybody's going to look up at that. You know, by far and away, the easiest way to become famous in criminology or any other enterprise is attack someone who is famous, because then people will inevitably attend you. The irony, of course, you know, you look at Lombroso, infinitely famous, you know, an absolutely asinine theory. But you've got to be outrageous to have lasting fame. Because anybody who talks about biology, they start with Lombroso, because you know, it's so easy to caricature, it's so easy to summarize. So you start with, you know, any one of two opposing way out positions, and then people will, that sounds very cynical, and I'm not willing to go into explicate it, but it really has enough accuracy in it to be intriguing. You know, you've got to put a name on it, and you've got to take an outre, if I can pronounce that right, an outside kind of position, a categoric position about something which is not categoric. Something which is very complicated, you take a single-minded position. You know, Godfreyson and Hershey, which is, you know, the field, generally, it's all self-control. You know, it's absence of self-control causes kind of, well, that's, you know, that's in a sense almost outrageous. You know, it's infinitely more complicated than that. But you take that position and you hold it against all opposition. Anyway, you've got me to wander off. But I did want to talk about the field as I see it, you know, and where it's going. It's a very exciting field, criminology. Very interesting, very intriguing. No more questions. I guess we've run our...
What do you... a
question.
I think you go. Change the area of focus here into the victims of white-collar crime, and how do you identify them, and what do you do to either assist them or, you know, with burglary, order restitution, those types of things.
I didn't plant that question. We're given a paper Friday on the victims of white-collar crime. There's virtually nothing on it. There's absolutely nothing on it. What we did was in California, myself and 3 colleagues, went out. There was a telemarketing scheme, which again is arguably white-collar crime. Was almost more of a con game. But they've got 5,800 and something people that they got money on, millions and millions and millions of dollars. And we got the list of the victims. And we sent out questionnaires to 355 of them, as I remember. Got answers back from 200 and something, which is astonishing. It maybe wasn't that. It was 54%, so it was a little lower than that. But I think they thought they were going to get some money back if they answered. We sent it out on state stationery. But then we didn't tell them they were going to get any money back. We asked them about it. And we asked them about the victimization. You know, how do you feel about it? And the paper we're going to give Friday, I think, is on the difference between men and women and their response to victimization by a telemarketing scheme. The results are not, you know, very surprising. The women are much more forgiving, a lot of self-blame. The thing I think the most interesting finding was that virtually all of the investors were men. You know, that men do that. They still do that in American families. Women didn't do that.
What age, are we talking an age group, or was it?
They were older. They were older women. Yeah. But we got the feeling that women are more conservative, less risk-taking in terms of these. It's a lovely scheme. I hope we can write a book on it. You know, they were selling oil wells. And I had thought that they, I had always thought that they'd be shy about, I thought it would be a very hard job to be a telemarketer, to get on the telephone and be constantly rejected. And I talked to some of them, and to my total and utter surprise, they didn't feel that way at all. They virtually, I kept saying, well, I hang up, you know, he says, that's perfect, that's exactly what I want. He says, I can't stand the people that engage me in conversation and waste my time. He says, my assumption is, he said, that I'm going to talk to 60, let's say 100 people, 2 of them I'm going to sucker out of those, and the quicker I can get rid of the other 98, the more effective use it is of my time. So I'm just delighted if they hang up on me, because that, you know.
So we should keep them on the line.
Not waste their time.
I tried once, you know, after I did this article, knew all this stuff, I tried talking to one of them, and it was hilarious. You know, I had these wonderful things. You know, well, why would you have to call me? I said, if this thing is so marvelous, you know, it's going to return a 60% income within 3 months. I said, you know, why do you need someone like me? I said, any rich person in the world ought to give you all the money immediately. So, and his answer was, well, that's the way, what was it, Microsoft, or who's the famous, the most rich man, and the richest man in America, Williams. What? No, not Gates. He says, Bill Gates started out that way. He says, we got to raise the money. Everything I said, and I thought I was enormously clever, he had a much better answer than my question. It's not that I hung up. I was very surprised. I had tried that once with a used car salesman, but I wasn't surprised that anything I said, he had an answer. Anything. He says, all right, he says, ask me questions 15 minutes. He says, you'll never know the price that I'm willing to sell that car at. He says, you will never find out. And I asked him questions for 15 minutes, and I never found out the price he was willing to sell that car at. You know, he'd say, well, what are you willing to pay for it, you know, etc. Anyway, if there are no other questions, we've worked. I really appreciate your putting the time in, and, you know, it's fun. I enjoyed it. It's a subject I'm very fond of. I spent my life working on it, and I very much enjoyed talking to you about it. And I expect we can go on, or I can go on. Now that I got you at my mercy, I could go on forever. But I do appreciate it, and maybe someday. Well, the one time I think I was in a symposium like this was a long time ago at Ohio State, and Cressy was there at the time, and you know, several other people working on white-collar crime. One of the audience was a woman named Diane Vaughn, who was on the program here. Diane was doing prison research, and we somehow or other caught her fancy that day, and she went into doing white-collar crime studies, changed dramatically from prison research, and wrote a superb book on the Rexall for her doctoral dissertation on the Rexall rebate thing, and I'm so proud of her that I can add next month, January, she's coming out with a book that ought to be very, very well received on the Challenger disaster as a study of. I think I'm almost sure it's a revisionist study. She's going to argue that all of the popular understanding of the Challenger was wrong, that all of the glib, she finds them glib explanation. It's going to come out on the 10th anniversary of the Challenger disaster, University of Chicago Press, which is a very good press. So we convinced one person, at least, that it's an exciting field. You know, it really is demanding. You know, I keep thinking you do a study of one-person patrol cars or two-person patrol cars. You know, big deal. You know, what impact is it going to have on crime? You know, so instead of 6,000 crimes, you have 5,800, if you're lucky. You know, if your conclusion is valid, which is arguable because it's a single-case study. White-collar crime, you know, again, I'm sure you're not going to revolutionize the world, but it's more important, I would argue. It's a more important phenomenon than street crime. Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Oh, it's my pleasure. It was